stop seeing history as the absolute truth of the past, but rather as a process. If you want to effectively discuss or disagree with conventional history, you must engage in this process. Speculation and anything else that wants to become history must go through this process. And once all this is clear in your head, you're ready to discuss history properly. In my last video, which is part 1 of 2, I recapped the first 1200 years of history, 3200 to 2000 BCE. And in this video, part 2 of 2, I'll be addressing a handful of questions and debate topics that I've discovered while researching that era. First, I'll discuss the debate truth versus history at length. Then I'll discuss a real example, and at the end, I'll answer the remaining questions and give my position on each debate. But before we get into all of it, I want to quickly orient everyone who's discovering me for the first time. Right now, I'm building a foundation for historical discussion, which is this project, and the goal of it is to provide a structure, some context, and sources for deeper historical discussion. If you want more depth about this project and what my future projects will entail, I recommend watching the final 8 minutes of my last video, starting from minute 2027. And if you want more context to this video, then go watch the first part of that last video up until 2027. All right, with that out of the way, let's get started. People often confuse history, meaning the academic subject of history, with the absolute truth of the past. And this seems to come up from time to time in my comments, so it's the first debate I want to address. And it's important to discuss this debate first because you must know the difference between the two before engaging in any other historical debate. So once the difference is clear in your mind, you can begin to have better historical discussions. And I do have a real example to share, so you'll soon understand why I'm framing this as a debate. But first I want to explain the difference, then elaborate on it, then I'll apply that knowledge to the example. So what's the difference? Well, in a nutshell, the difference between the truth of the past and the academic subject of history is that the truth is the goal and history is the process to get there. It's the best process we have to get to the truth. And even though it's the best, it does have its limitations. For instance, all histories are biased, even when they're trying to be objective. Evidence is sparse. History can be revised, and it should be when necessary. And history must be written a certain way in order to say something significant about the past. And these limits exist because we're human. It's simply the nature of who we are, and our strained relationship between the truth of the past and us attempting to know it. And you'll start to recognize these limitations when you stop seeing history as the absolute truth of the past, but rather as a process. And it's a process that must consider 4 unavoidable overlapping layers, which I call the 4 layers of history. And it's important to know these layers because these layers not only reveal these limitations, but they can also get tangled with each other if you've never taken the time to think about them and separate them. So let's take a moment to peel them apart. The first layer is one side of the debate, which is the absolute truth of the past. It's the starting point. It's what we want to know, the truth of the past. So this layer is the goal of history, to know the truth of the past. But once we lowly humans try to understand the past, we start to see limitations emerge. And these limitations are illuminated in the remaining 3 layers. And these 3 layers contain the other side of the debate, which is, of course, the academic subject of history. And it starts with the second layer, which is the evidence of the past. And it's all around us. And it helps us piece together the past, but it's limited because evidence is sparse. And think of it like a puzzle, where the pieces represent the evidence, except the pieces don't come in a nice box. Rather, the pieces are scattered all around a city or a region or the world, and some pieces we'll find, and some pieces will remain hidden for a while, and some might be lost forever. Either way, at any given point in time, some puzzles might have enough pieces to understand what it is, and other puzzles don't. And all of history is constructed through these puzzle pieces. But these pieces don't assemble by themselves. And that brings us to the third layer, the historians, who actually curate history, which means they find the puzzle pieces, they put them together, and they determine what they mean. So to a large degree, our understanding of the past is through their work. But at the same time, historians add new limitations by writing histories with their biases and flaws intact. Now, when you think a historian has a bias, you might think that it's something like a political agenda or something like that. And that's possible, but true historians are aiming for the truth. So a more natural bias would be the ones that stem from the historian's culture, education, gender, class, age, and century they lived. For example, My assessment of history as a man living in the early 21st century United States is probably different than a woman living in the early 18th century China. Our knowledge of the world is different, we care about different things, and we see the world through our cultural lens. It's something we can't escape. But the good news is that once you're aware of this, you can account for it. And as for the historian's flaws, that just means they made an incorrect assessment of the evidence. It happens because they're human, so all histories must be re-examined over and over again to weed out any misinterpretations. And that's when historiography comes into play, which is the history of the subject of history. And it can mean every history book ever written and all the methods used to assess the past, but it can also be specific to one particular topic. For instance, every history book written about World War II is the historiography of that topic. So this re-examination naturally happens when anyone wants to become an expert on any particular topic. Now, historians don't just write history books for themselves, rather they write them to share with the world, so the average person can understand the past too. And this brings us to the fourth layer, which consists of two groups, the Qs and the Echoes, who together are everyone else in the world discussing and perpetuating history to varying degrees of accuracy. And there's two dominant limitations in this layer. One is how many of these Qs and Echoes know accurate history, and two, how many of these Qs and Echoes perpetuate inaccurate history. Both are important. If people don't know history, then it can be lost forever. And if people perpetuate inaccurate history, then future generations are misguided. Think of a Clio as a history teacher or a history buff who stands on the shoulders of historians. They read a lot of history, cite their sources in historical arguments, respect the craft of history, think critically about history, and try to be accurate without overstepping, but technically are not trained historians. They can also be a megaphone for historians, or even guide and challenge current or future historians. And of course, they can be wrong, but like good historians, they are willing to change their interpretation once new evidence or a better interpretation forces them to do so. So in short, the Clios are the good students, teachers, and challengers of history. And the Echoes are anyone else who discusses history but doesn't know their sources. The Echo accepts and repeats what they hear from any source they trust, like historians, social media, peer groups, or political groups, but whether they're right or wrong, they are not actively vetting what they're hearing or saying. But that doesn't stop them from discussing it and perpetuating their perceived knowledge of history, and therefore can influence large groups of people. And I wouldn't say these Echoes are bad or lazy. I mean, they can be, but most of them are just living their lives and aren't invested in the craft of history as the Clio or the historian is. But the perception of history can definitely impact history itself, which is unfortunate, but the good news is that history can correct most misdirection through questioning, examining, and debating history. So when anyone is discussing history, these four layers together are always present for better or for worse. The first layer is the truth of the past, and it's the goal of history. The second layer is the remaining evidence, which is a fraction of the first layer. The third layer is the historian who collects evidence, interprets it, and presents it to the world. And the fourth layer is everyone else in the world who discusses it with varying degrees of accuracy. And all these layers together create our collective sense of the past. And by knowing the limitations in these layers, it helps all academics, or anyone else, account for them, so we can be as accurate as possible. And it's important to mention that these limitations do not discredit history. Rather, you must know them to discuss history properly. I know it can be frustrating to have these gaps of knowledge in our history due to lack of evidence, but at the same time, grounding knowledge in evidence prevents us from going down the wrong path or getting lost in speculation. So history can only go as far as the evidence allows. And biases and misinterpretations can be frustrating too, but as long as we know that every interpretation must be thoroughly vetted again and again, we can account for them as well. So in short, history is a process. It's not a settled dogma. It's attempting to accurately know the truth of the past, but must settle on provisional truths that are limited by evidence and interpretation that may change over time. And the accuracy of these provisional truths are also stabilized through this constant analysis and debate of both the evidence and various interpretations. So if you ever want to make a truth claim about the past, you must use this process. If you don't, then you're making truth claims about the past that aren't grounded in evidence, and that's speculation. And grounded history becomes conventional history, and speculation will remain in that realm until it can be grounded. And speculation isn't bad. It can guide future historians to reveal new truths about our past, but it won't become part of conventional history until it's grounded. And once all this is clear in your head, you're ready to discuss history properly. So let's go look at a real example. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that I'm not addressing the debate at all. Rather, I'm just explaining the difference between history and the truth. However, I frame this as a debate because that's how it comes up in my comments. What happens is, I'm talking about history in my videos, as in the academic subject of history, of course, and I'm citing my sources, then someone comments on my videos making a truth claim that both disagrees with what I'm saying and is outside the bounds of history. And what I mean by outside the bounds of history is they're outside of the process that I've been discussing. They're not citing new sources, they're not citing new evidence, and they're not reinterpreting old evidence. They're just saying I'm wrong. And I do have a few examples of this in my comments, but I picked this one because it addresses this debate and also includes a couple of other fallacies people often make. So I'll provide the full conversation here, but I'll only be summarizing my parts. But feel free to pause the video if you want to read my entire response. So on my channel and other social media, I post shorts that are just clips from my full-length videos. And one clip was titled King Minos Myth Tangled with History. It's from my full-length video number 13, The Minoan Greek Civilization is Founded. And Greek is in quotations because scholars wonder if we should consider the Minoans to be Greek or not. And in the clip, I highlight a plausible way how the myths surrounding King Minos evolved. I explain how some of the evidence found on the island of Crete lines up with the myths, like how some of the artwork of bulls and large storage rooms possibly gave rise to the myth of the Minotaur. And this wasn't my revelation alone, this is something that conventional historians have highlighted. And for those of you who need a quick refresher, the Minotaur was a man with the head of a bull, who was created because King Minos upset the god Poseidon. And the Minotaur was eventually killed by the Athenian hero Theseus in the labyrinth, and this myth is where we get the two terms clue and labyrinth. And if you take the time to watch the entire video, my plausible explanation of how the myth evolved is shored up with me saying, but we really don't know for sure. So ultimately, I'm highlighting an interesting correlation that is mere speculation because the evidence is limited. Now, despite all that, someone felt the need to respond with this comment, and I quote, "Or events transpired more or less as the myth describes, and modern historians are just a bunch of pretentious skeptics." And this person is probably a troll, but their comments are filled with fallacies, so it's a good example to use for this video. And let's just pause for a second so we can highlight our disagreement. Where I'm saying I'm not sure, they're saying it's probably true. They're making a truth claim. And this right here could have been the debate. They're moving the needle closer to truth than I would. And this is a perfectly normal historical debate. But as you will see, it gets derailed. So I said that historians draw inferences based off of evidence, which is scarce in this matter. So it's really hard to know where truth ends and myth begins. I also said that all inferences are constrained by the limits of science, meaning that science can't confirm that there ever was a man with a bull's head that was created by a god named Poseidon. Then I told the commenter that I'm always interested in learning more, so if they believe that the myth is true, then I'd love to hear their argument and read their sources. But instead of elaborating on their argument, they responded by saying, "You can't prove Theseus never existed any more than I can prove he did. The foundation of your argument is your assumption that all mythology has lost all historicity, for which you have no evidence, only a lack of evidence." At this point, I recognized the debate had shifted. We're no longer debating if the adventures of Theseus were true, we're discussing if we can prove anything at all. And that's when it hit me. This person, like so many others, is confusing truth with history. And again, this might be a troll, but I'm treating this person as being genuine because comments like this come up from time to time, and I think it's important to share these experiences in order to remind everyone how to discuss history properly. So just to clarify our new debate, where they're saying you can't prove anything at all, I'm saying, well, history says this much, and this is the best we have, and anything outside of that is speculation. Hence the debate topic, truth versus history, or your truth claim versus what history can tell us. Then I posted this long thing, which you can read by pausing this video, but I'll sum it up here. First, I addressed the term historicity. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's the historical authenticity of an event. And it's built off of evidence, it's not made up. I explained to this person that the authenticity of an event can be lumped into 4 categories. If there's no evidence to support a claim, then it's speculation. If it's cherry-picked evidence to support a claim that disregards other evidence, then it's a weak argument. And if it uses all available evidence to support a claim, then it's a strong argument. And finally, if all available evidence is used that generates 2 or more contradictory claims, which is to say that the same evidence is interpreted differently, then a natural debate will evolve and will continue to linger until it's decided by more evidence or a better interpretation. So in short, the historicity of an event is contingent on the strength of the evidence and the interpretation supporting it. It's either speculation or weak or strong or inconclusive. And if it's inconclusive, it spawns a debate. So with all that in mind now, if we look at their statement again, they said you can't prove Theseus never existed any more than I can prove he did. And as we know, the proof or the truth is the goal of history. And history, as in the academic subject of history, is the process to discover the truth. And understanding the truth can only go as far as the evidence allows. And in this case specifically, the evidence doesn't lead historians to a definite conclusion, only speculation about how the King Minos myth may have evolved. And on top of that, if this commenter believes we can't prove anything at all, then why even make a truth claim in the first place? The two statements actually contradict each other. It's like saying unicorns are real, and even though we can't prove it either way, you must believe they're real anyway. So their second response just ended up making their truth claim weaker. Then they followed it up with this statement. The foundation of your argument is your assumption that all mythology has lost all historicity, for which you have no evidence, only a lack of evidence. Well, first, as I mentioned, I don't believe Poseidon created a man with a bull's head because that goes against the limits of science. But in general, I think that myths stem from a combination of historical truth, religion, and cultural elements that may or may not be attempting to say something about that culture or the human condition. So I wouldn't be surprised if the adventures of Theseus were inspired by a real person, but after centuries of oral transmission, it evolved into something more epic and fictitious. And historians and I want to find historical truth in these myths. But like I said already, we can only go as far as the evidence allow. So their statement about what I assume was wrong. I am looking for truth in these myths, but I won't make a truth claim grounded in speculation. It's careless to believe these stories verbatim. Even if we overlook the fact that these gods and creatures don't interact with us today, what do we do if these authors who wrote about Theseus contradict one another? Like Euripides, Sophocles, Ovid, and Apollodorus. Whose version are we to believe? And also, since they were wrong about what I assumed, they mischaracterized my position. And I know it might sound like a stronger argument by saying, I assume all mythology has lost all historicity, but only say that if I actually assume that. By mischaracterizing my position, then every part of their argument built on top of that mischaracterization means nothing, because they're not attacking my argument anymore. They're attacking something else. They're attacking a straw man that they created, and that's a logical fallacy. Whoops. And finally, they said we have no evidence, only a lack of evidence. Well, we have some evidence. We have evidence from the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and other ancient Greek and Mediterranean cultures. And from that, we've established what we know and what we don't know. So if this person wants to make a truth claim about Theseus that goes against conventional history, then we need to hear their evidence around the claim. But if they don't have new evidence, then at the very least, if this person has a different interpretation, then we need to hear that. They shouldn't retreat and shift the argument when pressed. So this person, in the span of a few thoughtless words, managed to make a truth claim without defending it, shift the argument to something else when pressed, confused history with truth, mischaracterized my assumptions and made a weak straw man, and said we have no evidence when we actually have some, while at the same time speculating from the evidence that we do have. And unfortunately, but wisely, this commenter chose not to continue the conversation. And personally, I have nothing against this person. Rather, I had a handful of examples to choose from, so I just picked this one. But stuff like this comes up from time to time. That's why I wanted to address it in a video to help others discuss history properly. These comments seem to come up when I'm discussing stuff like why Sumer was the world's first civilization, why Egypt is the world's first nation, why the Akkadians are the world's first empire, who built the pyramids, or who were the Minoans or the Harappans. And I have to end up taking a step back and clarify what history says versus what my opponent believes is true. They tend to think that since history can't explain everything, their perception and speculation outside the bounds of history is better. Newsflash, it's not. So if you wonder why I think Sumer was the world's first civilization and not Göbekli Tepe, that's dated to around 9000 BCE, evidence and the interpretation of it. Do you know what will make me change my mind? Evidence or better interpretation, not speculation. Do you know why I think the Egyptians of the 3rd and 4th dynasties built the pyramids? Evidence and the interpretation of it. Do you know what will make me change my mind? Evidence or better interpretation, not speculation. And as I mentioned, speculation is fine. Historians love to speculate. They just know to keep their speculation in the realm of speculation when they don't know. So if we pull everything together with this example in mind, hopefully it's clear by now that history is a process and not a settled dogma. If you want to effectively discuss or disagree with conventional history, you must engage in this process. And this process establishes provisional truths. that are limited by evidence and interpretation, which may change over time. And the accuracy of these provisional truths are stabilized through constant analysis and debate of both the evidence and various interpretations. And once all this is clear in your head, you're ready to discuss history properly. Now that you know the difference between truth and history and know how to discuss history properly, you're ready to engage in real historical debates. And as I mentioned earlier and in my previous videos, I've come across a handful of questions and debate topics that were generated from researching the era 3200 to 2000 BCE. And right now I'll be answering those questions and give my position on each debate. Now, I won't be going into any depth in my answers, just a quick response. My answers stem from reading the 35 sources listed in my previous videos. So for the most part, I'll be reiterating the answers provided by conventional historians. And hopefully by now you should know that history is a process that includes questioning conventional history. So if you disagree with anything and want to engage in that process properly, please summarize your argument and cite your sources. Or if you have other sources or new interpretations and you think they'll add a new dimension, please let us know what they are in the comments. And no matter what type of response I see in my comments, I'll do my best to facilitate the conversation and organize any new sources as they're introduced. But keep in mind that since my focus will be on finishing this project, I won't be diving deeper into any of these answers until I'm done. And I know that sounds like a bummer, but right now I'm just planting lots of seeds to generate conversation and to highlight where my blind spots are. Then when I'm done with this project, I'll see what I have and I'll start a deep dive on other specific topics. But like I just said, I'm happy to be a facilitator in any conversations that pop up in my comments. And at the very least, if this video doesn't generate anything substantial or anything at all, just being aware of these questions and debate topics will give you a more sophisticated understanding of this era and history in general. Now, without further delay, here are the questions and debate topics stemming from the years 3200 to 2000 BCE and my position on all of them. Enjoy.